we're looking at some tools that are going to help us with our organic modeling and how we can work with these tools with our topology. And as always with this sort of section of the class, I'm sort of fiddling with primitives. And so I'm just going to create a cylinder with a little bit of resolution so I can show you some of these things. The first thing that I wanted to show you is a little bit more about selections. So we talked about face loops and edge loops. And you might remember that to select an edge loop, all we need to do is double click on an edge, and we have that selected all the way around. Now with the edge loop, again, we talked about in the lecture beforehand, we talked about the edge loop propagation, and when it gets to something like a pole here, where it's completely ambiguous what direction to continue, that edge loop just stops there. That's the termination of an edge loop. We can also select loops of faces. We talked about face loops. And so if you double click on a face, what you're going to get is just the entire object selected, or the continuous, any face that's in a sort of a continuous area. So in order to select a face loop, select a face and then shift double click on an adjacent face. And that's going to select a face loop. So if we select this face and then shift double click on the face above it, like the edge loop, we're going to keep selecting the faces until it becomes ambiguous which direction to continue in. Now, it can also be useful to select not whole edge loops and face loops, but partial edge loops and face loops. So the way that we can do that, this works the same way with both edges and faces, is we select, let's say we just want to select this part of an edge loop from this top, from the corner, the top corner to the bottom corner. So all we need to do is select the edge that forms one end of the edge of the partial edge loop, this one up here at the top, and then shift double click on the other extreme of it. So very similarly to selecting the whole face loops, except we're selecting opposite ends of it. So I'll do that again. So if we wanted to go from here all the way around to here, then I would shift double click on it. And now we don't have the whole edge loop selected, we just have part of it. So that way we could, do something with that. And with the faces, again, it's the same thing. We're going to click on one, and then if we shift double click on the other one, then we have that partial face loop selected. Another selection trick is to grow and shrink a selection. So if we had these four faces selected, for example, and we want to grow that selection so it propagates outward to select all these faces here, we can use the greater than sign on the keyboard. That's the shift period. So shift period, or this sort of greater than sign, we're going to grow the selection. It's going to select the faces that are surrounding our initial selection. And if we hit that again, then again it's growing. And if we hit that one more time, then it grows even further. And the opposite of that, shrinking the selection, works just the same way, except that we're using the less than sign, or the shift comma, shift comma, shift comma, shift comma, and we're back to our original selection. This works with vertices too. If I just selected one vertex and hit grow selection, you can see that we've expanded it to include all 9 of these vertices. And again, one more time. Incidentally, selecting the vertices sort of works the same way. If we click on one and then we double click on one somewhere else, then it will sort of select the vertices in between there. So that works similarly to the edges and faces. Select one of these, shift double click on another one, and it selected all the ones in between. Okay, we can also convert selections between components. So let's say we've got this edge loop selected that forms this corner of the cylinder here. If we use the command right-click marking menu, it's command right-click or control right-click if you're on a PC, then we have what I mentioned last time, access to a sort of selection-oriented marking menu. So here we have access to the grow selection and the shrink selection, like we were doing with the hotkeys. Here's also where we can get the ability to select edge rings and edge loops. And going to face paths, I think that's their terminology for a face loop. But what we can also do is if we've got edges selected, we can also go to faces and then select two faces. And that's going to convert the selection to any of the faces that were touching those edges we had selected. Likewise, if we had an edge loop, I've got the same edge loop here, and we wanted to go change the selection to vertices, then you see now we're in vertex mode and we've got the vertices that made up that original edge selection. Now you'll notice that in this marking menu we had a couple of different options. We had two edges or faces and also the two contained edges and faces and vertices, and that simply means that if you select that option, instead of selecting all of the edges that the faces were connected with, it was only the edges that were completely surrounded by your selection. So that can be handy in a different set of circumstances. So in this instance, I've got all the edges in this cap, including the ones down here. And then if we go to the contained faces, then you can see that we've just selected the faces on the cap. All right, so that's a little bit more about selecting components and converting between them. Another thing that I want to demonstrate here is something that you might have run into inadvertently, which is soft select. Now, soft select is a little bit notorious for how often it kind of accidentally gets activated, and it can be very easy to inadvertently get into this mode and not know what's going on. And basically it happens when you hit the B key. So if you hit B on the keyboard, this little tooltip comes up, soft select mode is on, tap B to turn it off. And they've added that because people so often inadvertently turn it on and don't know what's going on. But basically what this does is it not only modifies the vertices or the selections that you currently have, but a certain radius with a kind of fall off outside of it. So if you ever notice that vertices and other components that you have selected, this works in edge mode as well, that are moving around that you weren't anticipating, it's quite possible that you've got soft select on. If we hold down B and drag left and right, then that changes the radius of influence. So we can make a really big radius of influence and basically modify our whole object, or we can make it quite small and have quite a small fall off that doesn't really do too much. And we can access these settings in the tool settings. For our move tool, for example, we've got this little tab called soft selection down here. We can turn it off and on. We can change the fall off radius, and we can also change the fall off curve. So they've got different presets for how you might be able to influence your surrounding radius. And this is quite useful for doing organic modeling, because if you've got a mesh that's representing a bone or a face or a character or an animal, when you're wanting to tweak those vertices, often you want to change a larger area with a little bit of a softer fall off than kind of doing vertices individually, and then you get sort of weird results, and it's less. You're less able to control it. So that soft select is quite useful for doing that sort of modeling. I'm going to create a cube, and we're going to talk about smoothing. There's a few different ways that you can smooth meshes in Maya. One of them is by actually adding actual resolution to your mesh, and that's under Mesh Smooth. So we can take a look at the options here. I'll reset those. And we have the number of divisions. And this is kind of the, we're adding these divisions exponentially, but this is basically changing how many more times the polygons we want to add. And so I don't mean that adding a division level of 2 will create twice the polygons, but instead it's going to create, well, there's 16 polygons for every single polygon we had before, so you can kind of do the math on that. So you'll notice what's happened here is not only has it added more faces to the object, but it's smoothed it out so that we've changed from a cube to more of a spherical object. And one comment on this kind of spherical object, this is actually much more of a cleaner starting point if you're going to be sculpting spherical objects. Typically, this isn't always the case, but typically this is going to create a cleaner object than if you created a sphere to start out with. And I wonder if you can see why that might be when I'm comparing these two models. The first is because on this object we have a pole here, whereas we don't have any poles, or at least we don't have any poles that have more than 4 edges coming into them. These technically are poles here because they only have 3 edges coming into them, but that's more desirable, I think, in this situation than this kind of pole. Also, on this object, the smooth cube, all of the faces are roughly the same size, whereas over here on this mesh, we've got larger faces down here, and they're quite rectangular. And then we go up to these much smaller faces, and they're rectangular, kind of in the different axis, and they get quite small at the top. And that can create problems with UV mapping a little bit, and some other operations that this is just more of a simpler mesh to work with. So that's just a recommendation if you're making cells or other sort of round objects, then this kind of starting point can be helpful. When you're creating eyeballs, that's kind of a different situation. Sometimes a sphere is better for creating eyeballs because you already have the loops going in the proper direction. So let's say you needed to make a pupil. You know, you've already got that kind of shape to work with. Whereas with the cube, you would have a hard time cutting a round shape in here, although it would be possible. So always consider sort of what kind of thing you're making and what sort of axis of symmetry that thing might have. So back to smoothing. The problem with this type of smooth operation, especially if we went sort of overboard on it and added all of this, all of these faces are part of your model. You don't, if you need to make further changes to the model, it becomes a lot more difficult to move things around. You know, if you have to work with the edge loops and adding detail here. When you're creating a model, you want to keep things low poly as much as possible as you're working, so that you can so that it's just easier to work with. An alternative to that kind of smoothing is something that you've probably encountered, and that's the smooth mesh preview. So when I hit 3 on the keyboard, I get a smoothed object, but the faces aren't baked into the mesh. Basically what we're getting is underneath the hood, we're getting the similar operation as what we did with the mesh smooth, but it's reversible. At any time, we can switch between the 1 key and the 3 key and get back to our low resolution version and our smoothed version. So when you're modeling, when you're in the process, I highly recommend you use the 3 key to look at what your mesh is going to look like if it's been smoothed, but then you have the option to go back to 1. And I don't recommend modeling while you're in smooth mode. I recommend you model in 1 mode, unsmoothed mode. So again, the 3 key is just a preview of a smooth operation. It turns out that when you're rendering, Mental Ray does give you the opportunity to render this smoothed version. And so you don't actually have to go in and do the mesh smooth operation. On the other hand, if you're rendering something with something like Maya Software doesn't render this as as smooth. So if I'm rendering using render software or Maya software, it'll just show you the cube even though it looks smooth in the viewport. So we'll talk about rendering later on in the course, but I just wanted to mention that. Something that's related to smoothing, but is a distinct topic, is how an edge responds to light. And it doesn't appear as though we have any light. We haven't added any lights. We haven't gone to create lights, adding lights. But Maya has a default lighting situation when you're modeling. And the normals of an object, again, we talked about normals as the direction that a face is facing. The normals of the object define how light bounces off that model. What you might notice here is that even though we've got these individual faces here, it appears when we're looking at this cylinder end on, and it's kind of faceted on the screen just because the projector is not so great and I'm running this over VGA, but trust me that it does sort of appear smooth. However, we've got this edge up here on this corner that appears hard. It's a hard edge. Now, you probably didn't think about that because it seems pretty normal to have, because you've got more edges over here and it's a cylindrical object, whereas this is a corner. But I can change this type of visibility so that it does appear faceted along these edges. Likewise, I could change all of them so that this corner does not appear sharp. See, it appears smooth. Now there's this weird black stuff going on, and that's because we've sort of pushed the normals and how they're displaying too far. So what I'm doing here is I'm changing how the normals are interpolated across an edge. I can go, and I'm using the shift right mouse marking menu to access the tools for this. Soften, harden edge. We can harden an edge, and it's a little hard to see, but if we select this edge loop around here, this is going to make much more of a difference. Harden edge. Now we've resolved that problem. Now we've got this hard edge here, and you can see this edge also that we did at the beginning is also appearing hard. Or we can select all of these. Typically, what you want with a cylinder is to have those edges appear soft. So it's related to smoothing in that it defines how smooth your model appears, but it's not related to changes in your geometry or your topology. It's not adding any new edges or faces. It's just changing how it's responding to light across that sort of where two faces meet. And this is actually how bump maps work. And we'll talk about bump maps later on. But bump maps change how the surface is reacting to light to create the illusion that you have variation in the surface. So this is exactly the same way that a bump map works, by changing the illusion of how those faces are responding to light. So I talked about silhouettes in the lecture before, and I wanted just to show you how you can do that. So up here in this lighting panel, we've got lighting, and I said we've got this default lighting in the viewport. What we can do is turn off all lighting and click Use No Lights. And now we just have a silhouette. We just have a completely black, flat object. And we can get a better sense of how our silhouette is reading in our scene. So particularly with characters or other things that are supposed to have some kind of character associated with them, this is a good way to know whether your modeling is creating the shapes that you're intending, or whether you're just kind of mucking around with details and your overall broad shape doesn't really have very much impact. Turn the lighting back on, to use default lighting. And I'm going to talk about Booleans now. So Boolean operations are a little bit controversial. And they're controversial because they can either create garbage or they can create really excellent, quick modeling shortcuts. And whether they create garbage or not is really up to the user, and that's why they're controversial. So I'm also going to create a sphere, and I'm going to give this 12 edges here. All right. So the Boolean operation, which you might be familiar with the idea of how it works, is basically combining and subtracting, adding and subtracting objects from each other. So if we've got the one object selected and shift select the other object, under mesh, Booleans right at the top, almost asking you to use them, Booleans, and we're just going to use a difference. So now we've had the sphere being subtracted from the cylinder. Okay, that's interesting. That looks like it could be useful. But stop for a minute and take a little bit of a closer look at the geometry that this has created. Instead of seeing the faces that the sphere had and the faces that the cylinder had, think about this as a single object, which it now is, and you'll quickly realize that this is a pretty messy object. We've got n-gons here, we've got n-gons here, we've got edges that look like they're lining up or being stopped short. We've got messes all over the place, and this is actually pretty hideous. And if we hit 3, then things get even worse, and it's just a bad situation, and it's going to be incredibly hard to clean that up so that we create a nice, smooth transition. Okay, so I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to tell you, don't use Booleans like that. However, there is a but. And there is a way that you can use Booleans to good effect, but you have to be careful about how you set up the geometry ahead of time. So we've got a cylinder here that's got 12 divisions in this axis, and we've got a sphere that's got 12 divisions in each axis. And so we can take one of these, and I'm just going to see if I'm going to turn on wireframe on shaded, under shading, so that I can see the wireframe of this other object that was shading wireframe on shaded. You can toggle that off and on. I like to use that when I'm modeling because then I can see I'm still in shaded mode. It's not wireframe, which you would get to with the with 4, but so we can still see the objects in shaded mode, but we've got those wires on top of them. That's fine. Okay, so I'm going to hold down the V key, make sure we've got the middle square selected so that this can be moved in all axes. Hold down the V key and middle mouse click on that vertex. And now I know that I've snapped this sphere right to that vertex. I can move this up, scale it down. But what you'll notice now is that all of these edges are perfectly lining up with the edges between the sphere and the cylinder. So now when I do the Boolean operation, if I do mesh Booleans difference, actually we've got pretty clean geometry, right? There's no n-gons here. These edges have lined up. I can select a single vertex and move it around just to make sure. Oh, you know what, actually, it looked like we had a clean operation, but you'll notice that these two vertices were sitting on top of each other and they haven't actually been merged. So what I would want to do before I moved on would be to select all of the vertices and do an edit mesh merge. And now hopefully now those vertices have been merged together that were sitting on top of each other, and now we just have single vertex. So that's why Booleans are a little bit controversial, because even when they look like they have created clean geometry, even when you're careful, sometimes they can do funny things. But now that we've merged them, we've actually been able to create, I hope, a nice spherical indentation in a cylinder. And if we hit 3 on the keyboard, and I'll turn off wireframe on shaded. We've created a pretty nice smooth object here. I wonder if you can notice something. It's a little hard to see here. But we've actually got a little bit of, when we've smoothed this object, we've got some pinching underneath. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can kind of see these shadows here that define some kind of pinching. And if we look at our geometry, it's clear why that is happening. And that's because we've got triangles on the underside of this cylinder. So triangles are really not very ideal when it comes to smoothing objects, and especially as they're all coming into this central pole. So is there any way that we can fix that issue of this sort of pinching on the bottom of this object? The top looks fine, but the bottom is a little bit ugly. Okay, so there's a couple of things that we can do with this that'll help. And one of them is just to add some edge loops around the bottom of this object. So if we shift right click, go into insert edge loop mode, if I want to add an edge loop around here, I can try clicking on here, but that's actually not going to work. Remember, because the insert edge loop tool needs quads in order to go around. So even though it looks like maybe an edge loop should be able to go around here, that's not going to work out so well. So one option would be if I go into face mode and select all the bottom faces, and we've got extra ones selected, so I want to make sure that I control click and get rid of, let's deselect those and try this again a little bit tighter. Control click. Okay, so now we've got the bottom faces selected, and now I could extrude, go into the extrude mode, and just turn the offset in just a little bit. Okay, so I've extruded these faces, the bottom faces in, and effectively what I've done is I've created an edge loop all the way around here. So that's one way I could create an edge loop around the bottom of a cylinder. Another way, I'm just going to undo that. Another way is what I like to use more often, and that's with the offset edge loop tool. So we looked at the insert edge loop tool, but if I shift right click while in edge mode, I can find this one called offset edge loop tool. And what that does, if you click on an edge, and then you can drag back and forth, is it's going to create an edge loop, 2 edge loops, one on either side of the currently selected edge loop. So I'll undo again and show you that again. So if I'm in object mode, I can access it here, offset edge loop tool, or if I'm in edge loop or edge mode, similarly we can get to that edge loop tool. And then we're clicking and dragging left and right on this edge so that we've got a fairly tight set of edges here. So that's the offset edge loop tool. So we've added some resolution here, but we still have these triangles on the bottom of this object. So what I actually want to do is I want to go into edge mode, and I'm just going to select every alternate one. And I'm going to shift right click, delete edge. So now I've deleted every alternate edge, and the resulting mesh is quads now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. It looks a little bit like a Trivial Pursuit pie thing, but we've basically created a quad only mesh now. We still have a pole in the middle, but if we hit 3, we don't have any of that pinching. We've smoothed it, and we've got a much cleaner object now. And because we've added those edge loops in here, we also have a tighter corner on the bottom of the object, whether or not that's what we intended. If we don't want that, then what we can do is we can either move these edges away from the corner. And again, we can't just single click and go all the way around because we've got poles here. So that's going to terminate our edge loop selection. So we're going to have to go a little bit manually and select those ones. And now if we hit 3, we've got a much softer corner. Likewise, if we wanted to make this a lot tighter, we could make these edges very, very close to each other. And now when we hit 3, we've got a really tight corner there. There are other ways to sort of fix those sort of triangles. So if I go, I like to work with 12-sided cylinders because they're a lot easier in many respects. So what, again, to make all of these quads, you can just select every alternate one and delete them, and that'll give you quads. But you still have that pole in the middle. So what some people like to do instead is just to select all of the edges at the top. And the way that I selected all of those was basically shift click all of these ones and then use the shrink selection to shrink in. If I do it twice, that's not going to work. It's going to shrink all the way down to nothing, so then I'm just hitting Control double click to deselect the outside edge loop, and now I've got these ones. So many different ways to make selections, but I can, if I hit, I should do delete edge. Now I've got this sort of blank canvas n-gon, and I could add divisions in here to, well, we'll talk about the multi-cut tool later on, but just to show you, I could sort of go around and cap off the face this way, and now we've got, again, quads all around, and it's going to smooth nicely, and we don't have any poles on the top face here, so that's an alternate way to sort of cap off a triangle, a cylinder, without having any quads, or any triangles, I should say. So with this one, we were able to create a slightly smooth corner here, although still quite sharp. And this brings me to the idea that edges and corners in computer graphics, by default, they're typically razor sharp. And that's a pretty big tip-off that you're dealing with computer graphics that don't look very realistic. If you look at any real world objects like the desk that you're sitting at or the keyboard, even though it looks like the keyboard has a very sharp corner, there's a tiny, tiny little bit of rounding to it. And so when you're modeling things in Maya, it's typically a good idea to add a little bit of softness to the corner, whether through this method here, where we've got these tight edge loops here and smoothed it, or we can also use the bevel tool. And so in this case, I'm just going to select the edges all the way around the top and all the way around the bottom. And with shift right click, we can get to the bevel edge tool. And by default, that's going to create a very broad bevel that's not going to be very appealing. So we can change the fraction to something quite low, maybe even 0.02 or something like that, right? That's creating a nice tight bevel. And so that just gives a little bit of a roundness or a little bit of an edge to the corner so that the light can glance off it, and it's just a little bit more appealing, so that when you're adding lighting and textures and materials to your scene, it's just a little bit more realistic. So with that bevel operation, we could also increase the number of segments that it creates to even round that off even further. And you'll notice that one of these edges has come in sharp and the other ones are kind of soft. So I could double click and select that one and soften that edge. And now it's a little bit smoother there. So this is a combination of adding geometry, changing the normals so that it's a little smoother. So bevel is a good tool to work with, especially with hard surface modeling. If you're modeling instruments and things like that, you want to bevel the edges a little bit. And also, because we've got so much resolution here, if we hit 3 on the keyboard, we still have quite a nice tight corner, but the profile of the cylinder is smoothed nicely. So those can work in concert together. Like Booleans, if you don't use them properly, they can create some pretty messy geometry that take a lot of cleanup. But if you do bevel things carefully, then the cleanup should be sort of minimal, and they can be used quite effectively. Okay, let's take a look quickly at the modeling toolkit. So in the Digital Tutors course that I asked you to view, for today, you probably looked at the quad draw tool, and that's a tool for retopology. And so I'm not going to cover that right now, but that's quite handy. The modeling toolkit in general is just sort of a collection of things and tools that are in one sort of handy area that you can work with. See, we've looked at the extrude tool, the bridging, beveling before. We've looked at booleans and smoothing. So those are sort of just collected here. You can also go into different component modes and change some of the selection and symmetry and stuff like that as well here. So what I wanted to talk about just now are basically the multi-cut and the target weld tools, just to finish up here. And the multi-cut is extremely handy. The multi-cut tool is basically slicing and dicing and adding different things to your geometry. So you can see that it snaps to vertices, which is handy, and it snaps to edges. And there's a whole bunch of modifiers that work with the multi-cut. You can, if you scroll down here, you can access the keyboard and mouse settings. And I highly recommend you take a look at these different modifiers so that you can work with the multi-cut tool more effectively. Things like shift, holding down shift will sort of snap to the midpoint here. But then if I click and drag, we can also snap to 10% increments. So let's say I wanted to go to 70%, and then I could shift and go to 30% because this edge is running the other direction, and then shift back to 70%, 70%, and sort of do it perfectly that way, which is a little bit tedious, but if you want that precision, that will work. And hit enter to complete. Or what you can do with the multi-cut tool, I hit Y to get back into that tool, Y on the keyboard. If I hold down the control key, we get a preview of an insert edge loop. So this functions exactly the same way, or not exactly the same way, but it also functions as an insert edge loop tool. So I can kind of click and insert some edge loops. If you control middle mouse click, it'll add an edge loop halfway between the other ones. So even if I've got the preview up here and I middle mouse click, it puts one halfway in between. Middle mouse click, so that's control middle mouse clicking. So that's pretty handy. That's quite useful. There's a few other functions that this multi-cut tool can do which are useful, so I encourage you to sort of read up on that. But that's the basic operation. Okay, the target weld tool is basically about merging vertices together. So we've looked at merging vertices in a sort of global sense, but if you want to specifically snap vertices to weld them together, you can do that with this tool. So dragging from one vertex onto another will snap and weld those vertices together. If, on the other hand, we wanted to connect, as you can see here, the left mouse button is dragging to merge the components. But if we wanted to snap to a central point, we could just middle mouse drag and it would snap to a central point. So that's the target weld tool. So the quad draw tool, just briefly, you might remember that it requires a template to work off of. The quad draw tool is not very good at just creating geometry from scratch. What you want to use is an object like this to work as a template on top of. So if I just click on the quad draw tool with this selected, basically what's happening is we're manipulating this mesh, and that can be useful, but it can also be quite destructive, and it's not really that suitable for that kind of thing. So instead, what it's better at is if you wanted to create a mesh that's sort of sitting on another mesh, to use a mesh as a template, either go to Modify, Make Live, or you can click on this icon, on this magnet icon, that's going to make the selected object live. And essentially what that does, if you Modify, Make Live, you'll see a little highlight here, P-Cylinder 2 is live. And now if we go into the quad draw tool and we create geometry, basically what we're doing is we're creating geometry that's sitting on top of this live object. So as we're creating geometry, we are snapping, essentially snapping all of these vertices to our live object. And we can see that we've got this transform constraint set to the live surface. And up here in this box here, we can see which object we have that's currently live. So if I turn that off, then we can get back to our new mesh and our old mesh and use this guy for whatever we wanted to create it for. So that's kind of how the quad draw tool operates. And again, I'm not going to go into the details for all the little hotkeys and commands, but it's got a huge number of modifiers and manipulators that make retopology really quite quick.